She asked it the way she asked most things, plainly, without apology, without making it larger than it was. "May I sit with you?" The man on the church steps looked up. He had been sitting there long enough that the afternoon light had moved off the top step and was now on the second, which meant at least an hour, maybe more. His hat was on his knee. His coat was the color of old bark and needed mending at the left elbow. He had the look of a man who had set something down and forgotten how to pick it up again. He looked at Ruth Calloway, and she looked at him, and neither of them had any claim on the other, except that it was a Sunday in October in Harlan, Nebraska, and the church was empty behind them, and the town was quiet, and she had come outside to get air and found a man sitting alone on the steps in a way that she recognized because she had sat that same way herself, in that same spot, 2 years prior, the Sunday after her husband died. "I don't mind," he said. She sat. The October light was thin and slanted, the cottonwoods along the creek showing their last yellow, the air carrying the first real cold of the season. They sat without talking for a while, which suited her and seemed to suit him, and she looked at the street and he looked at his hat, and the quiet between them was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of people with enough weight on them that silence felt like rest. His name was Daniel Voss. She did not know this yet. She knew only that he was weary in the way that goes past tired, the kind of weary that has a specific cause, and that he was sitting on the church steps on a Sunday afternoon, and no one had come to find him. She did not know, sitting there in the thin October light, that she was the one who ought to have been found first. Ruth Calloway had lived in Harlan for 11 years, first as the wife of George Calloway, who had farmed 50 acres on the South Road and done it well enough, and then as his widow, which she had been for 2 years and which had required her to learn the shape of a life she had not planned for. George had been a solid man, kind in the particular quiet way of a man who does not say much but means all of it. When he died, a swift and total thing, his heart simply stopping one morning in the barn, no warning and no farewell. He had left her the 50 acres, the house, the stock, a root cellar full of preserves, and the kind of silence that takes the shape of the person who is no longer in it. She had kept the farm herself, which the town had expected her not to do. She had hired a man named Ord Hester for the heavy field work, and she had done the rest, and at the end of the first year, the farm was not failing. At the end of the second year, it was not only surviving. The town had adjusted its opinion of her in the slow, undeclared way that towns adjust such things, which is to say that no one said anything directly and everyone understood it had changed. But the farm was not the hard part. The farm she could manage. The farm had tasks that filled the hours and required her whole attention and gave back visible results. The beans coming in, the root cellar full, the fences mended before first snow. Results she could point to, even if only in her own accounting. The hard part was the other thing, the interior thing, the long evenings in the second chair and the particular sound a house makes when there is only one person in it. The sound was not a noise. It was an absence of the noises that had always been there, the creak of George's boots on the floor above, the sound of him banking the stove before bed, the way he cleared his throat when he was reading something he disagreed with. Small sounds. She had not known while he was alive that she was listening for them. She had not known until they were gone and the house was simply quiet, every evening, in a way that a house occupied by only one person is quiet. She had gotten through it. Not gracefully and not without cost, but she had gotten through it the way she got through most things, by putting one foot in front of the other and not looking too far ahead and trusting that the ground would be there. What she did not know was that the ground, on one specific night in the first winter, had been placed there by a man she had never spoken to. She had not known there was a ground to miss. She had thought, that night, that she was only deciding whether to let the fire go out or build it up again. She had not understood until much later what she had really been deciding. Daniel Voss had come to Harlan in the spring, from a place he did not talk about much, which was Iowa, and from a life that had reorganized itself in ways he was still getting used to. He had a daughter named May, who was 6 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and he had taken a position as the farrier for the combined stock operations of 3 farms on the North Road, which was steady work and required the kind of focused skill that kept a man's hands occupied and his mind from going where it should not. His hands knew what to do with a hoof rasp and a pritchel and a nail set. That was something. There were hours of every day when the work was entire and sufficient and left no room for anything else, and he had come to value those hours in a way he never had before Catherine died. His wife, Catherine, had died 18 months ago. He did not say this readily. He said it when people asked and sometimes when they did not, because he had found that carrying a thing in secret gave it weight, and naming it plainly, however much it cost, kept the weight from becoming crushing. He had learned this by accident. A man at a livery stable in Iowa had asked, in the ordinary course of conversation, whether he had family, and Daniel had said he had a daughter and had started to say he had a wife and had stopped, and the stopping had been worse than the saying would have been. Catherine had been gone 18 months. May still asked for her at odd moments, in the particular way of a child who has accepted an explanation and not yet fully believed it. She asked for her when she was tired, mostly. When she was sick, once in the summer, she had asked for her mother in a voice that Daniel had had to leave the room to answer. He had stood outside May's door in the hallway of the Beckwith house, and he had held the door frame and breathed through it, and then gone back in and answered her steadily, because steady was what she needed, and steady was what he was going to be. He had 3 good friends in Harlan, which was 2 more than he'd had in Iowa by the end. He had a rental room at the Beckwith place on the edge of town, clean and warm and suitable, and May slept in the small room beside his and came into his bed in the mornings and put her cold feet against his legs without warning, which was the best part of most days. He was in the balanced accounting of things, managing. But managing is not the same as well, and he knew it. And the Sunday, he sat down on the church steps and could not quite make himself stand back up again. He had known it more clearly than usual. The sermon had been about rest, which had struck him as either kind or cruel, depending on how you held it. May was with the Beckwith girl, who watched her Sunday afternoons. He had no reason to hurry home. He sat down and he did not get back up, and then a woman came outside and stood on the step above him and asked, plainly and without making it large, if she could sit with him. He had said he did not mind. He had not said, "I am glad." He was glad. She found out his name from the Reverend Marsh, whom she asked the following Wednesday without intending to. She'd been thinking about the man on the steps all week in the background, way that you think about something you cannot quite place. She had described him to the Reverend, coat that needed mending, hat on his knee, farrier for the North Road operations, and the Reverend had said, "That'll be Daniel Voss. Lost his wife last year. He's got a small daughter." He had said it simply, pastor's shorthand for a parishioner carrying a known weight. Ruth had nodded and moved on to the business she'd come to discuss, which was the church social in November, and she had not said anything else about Daniel Voss. She thought about him, though. She thought about the particular quality of the quiet they had sat in for 40-some minutes on the church steps before she had said she ought to get back, and he had said he supposed he should as well, and they had stood and gone their separate ways without exchanging names. She thought about the way he had held his hat and looked at it like it was something he was asking a question of, and the way his shoulders had been, and the precise quality of the weariness on him. She recognized it because it was the same weariness she had carried, and she knew its weight and its shape from the inside. She thought about what she had wanted to do and had not done, which was to say something useful. She had not known what useful was. She had sat beside him, and that was all, and she did not know if it had mattered or not and suspected she would not find out. The following Sunday, she arrived at church early. He was already there, in the 3rd pew from the back on the right side, with a small girl beside him, who had dark braided hair and was reading very carefully from a picture Bible with the focused absorption of a child who has been told to be still and has decided to make it interesting. Ruth took the 4th pew from the back on the other side, and she did not catch his eye during the service. Afterward, outside, he found her. "I didn't get your name last week," he said. "Ruth Calloway," she said. "Daniel Voss." He had the child on his hip, though the child was not quite the right size for hips anymore. "This is May." May looked at Ruth with the direct appraisal of a 6-year-old. "You sat with my papa," she said. Ruth looked at her. "I did." He was sad, May said, as a statement of fact with no cruelty in it. Children that age say true things because they have not yet learned the cost. "I know," Ruth said. Daniel did not say anything. He looked somewhere between embarrassed and grateful, which was an expression she was coming to think was simply his face. "Your hair's the same as my mama's," May said. Then she turned and grabbed a fistful of her father's coat collar and addressed herself to something in the middle distance, the way children move on when they have said what they had to say. Ruth looked at Daniel. He was looking at his daughter with the expression of a man who has learned that children will say the thing he cannot. "My wife had brown hair," he said finally. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Ruth said. It was kind. He looked at her then, directly, for the first time. It was a brief look, and it was the kind of look that holds more than it displays. "May I call on you sometime?" he said. It was not quite a question. "You may," she said. He came on a Thursday, with May, who explored Ruth's kitchen with the systematic thoroughness of a child cataloging a new world. Ruth had made apple cake, the last of the season's apples, and May ate 2 pieces with the earnest focus of someone taking a job seriously, and then asked to see the chickens, and Ruth took her out to the chicken yard and let her collect the eggs, and May handled each one with the careful reverence of something known to be fragile. Daniel sat on the porch step and drank his coffee and watched through the yard fence, and Ruth stood with May in the chicken yard, and at one point May held up an egg and announced the color of it, which was brown, which May apparently found significant, and Ruth said brown eggs and white eggs tasted the same inside, and May considered this and said she still liked the brown ones better, and Ruth said that was a fair position. She glanced toward the porch and found Daniel watching her. He looked away. They stayed 2 hours. May fell asleep on the wagon seat on the way home. Her father had reported the following Sunday, before they had reached the end of the South Road. Ruth thought about them all week. Not in the tentative, uncertain way she had thought about him after the church steps, but in the specific and inhabited way you think about people who have taken up a real place in your mind. She thought about May and the brown eggs. She thought about Daniel on the porch step, his hands around his coffee cup, the careful way he watched his daughter. She thought, for the first time in a long time, that the evenings were shorter than they had been. Not shorter, in fact, shorter in the feeling of them. What she did not know, thinking all of this, was that it had very nearly not happened, that she had very nearly not been here to sit on any church step, or make any apple cake, or think about anyone or anything at all. That in the deep of the first winter after George died, on a night she did not much let herself remember, a small specific thing had held her. She did not know yet what that thing was, or who had placed it there. She found out in November at the church social, the way you find out most things in a small town, sideways, through someone else's conversation. She was standing at the edge of the room with a cup of cider, listening to the Reverend's wife tell a story about a family on the North Road, when Ord Hester came and stood nearby, and the conversation shifted. Ord had been her hired man for 2 years. He was a talker when there was cider and an audience, and he had a story he had apparently told before, about the winter 2 years back when he had found the widow Calloway's woodpile completely exhausted on a night that dropped to 6 below. Ruth went still. She remembered that night. She remembered it the way you remember a night that frightened you badly enough that you learned from it. She had been 3 months into widowhood, and she had been careless with the wood, or not careless exactly, but absent-minded in the particular way of someone whose mind was not fully inhabiting the world. And she had gone out on that Thursday night in January to find the woodpile down to 6 thin pieces, and the temperature still dropping, and the nearest neighbor 3/4 of a mile off in the dark. She had stood at the woodpile for a long time in the cold. She had not been deciding to freeze. She understood that clearly now. But she had not, in that moment, been deciding very urgently against it either. She had been standing in the dark with 6 pieces of wood, and the cold of a Kansas January settling into her bones, and she had been thinking about George, and the silence in the house and the long remainder of the winter, and she had not been deciding very urgently about anything at all. And then there had been wood. She had heard the wagon before she saw it, coming up the South Road, and in the dark she had made out the shape of a man in a coat and a load of cut cordwood on the wagon bed, and he had turned into her gate without hesitating, and he had brought the team alongside the woodpile and begun unloading. She had called out that she had not ordered any wood. He had said something about a wrong turn and a surplus load, and would she take it off his hands or not because the team was getting cold. She had said she supposed she would take it. He had stacked it and driven away, and she had gone inside and built the fire up and sat by it. And something had shifted in her that night, some angle of the dark, and she had decided, the word was right, she thought, sitting with her cider in the warm social hall, it had been a decision, that she would not stand at the woodpile in January and be cold and not decide against it. She would stay. She would build the fire up and she would stay. She had never known who the man was. She had assumed it was someone who knew George, settling some old arrangement. She had asked around gently in the spring and gotten nothing clear. She looked at Ord Hester now. "Who stacked the wood?" she said. Ord turned and looked at her. He had not realized she was there. "Beg pardon, Mrs. Calloway. Who stacked the wood?" she said. "That January. You said someone brought wood to my place." Ord shifted his cup. "Well, it was a fellow passing through on his way to the Morrison farm. Had a cord too many and a long drive back. He was new around here, I think. A farrier, or heading to be. I had said something at the feed store, without thinking, about the widow Calloway's woodpile being thin. I should not have said it, I suppose. It wasn't my place, and he must have taken it up. The room was warm and full of voices, and Ruth stood in the middle of it with her cider cup and understood something she had not understood before. She set the cup down on the nearest table. She moved through the room with the particular controlled steadiness of a woman who is feeling something large and is not going to feel it here, in public, in front of everyone. She found Daniel Voss at the far end of the room with May asleep against his shoulder, the child's dark braids loose now and her face slack with the total surrender of a sleeping 6-year-old. He was talking to one of the North Road farmers about the state of the winter pasture, and he looked up when Ruth came to stand in front of him, and he read her face and stopped talking mid-sentence. "Can you come outside?" she said. He excused himself. He shifted May to one arm with the practiced ease of a man who had carried a sleeping child before, and he followed Ruth out the side door into the cold November dark. She stopped at the edge of the building where the light from the window fell on the ground in a yellow square. She turned to face him. 2 years ago, she said. January. A cord of wood on a Thursday night. He was still. Something moved through his face, a searching, a slow recognition, the way a man looks when a thing he had set down and forgotten comes back. "The South Road," he said. "Yes." He was quiet. May stirred against his shoulder and settled, some dream adjustment, and was still again. "I had been in Harlan 3 days," he said slowly. "I was not yet hired by anyone. I stopped at the feed store, and the man behind the counter, I don't know his name now, Ord Hester, he said, without meaning anything particular by it, that there was a widow south of town who was going through wood fast and her pile was getting thin." He paused. "I had a cord I had cut for a job that had fallen through. I was passing that road anyway." He looked at her. "It was not a large thing." "I know," Ruth said. "I know you didn't mean it as a large thing." "Were you?" He stopped. He held his daughter a little closer. "Were you all right?" She looked at him in the cold and the lamplight, and she thought about the woodpile and the 6 thin pieces in the dark and the long question of the winter that she had not been deciding very urgently about. "You brought wood," she said. "I built the fire. And then I stayed." She held his eyes. "That's all. But I want you to know that it was the whole of it." He understood what she was telling him. She watched him take it in, the weight of what a wrong-turn surplus cord of wood had meant to a woman he had not known existed on a night she had not told him about, and she watched him carry that and not say anything for a long moment because there was nothing adequate and he knew it. May made a small sound. She opened her eyes, the half-open eyes of a child surfacing from deep sleep, and she looked at Ruth with the unfocused, honest look of someone not yet fully awake. "Mrs. Calloway," May said, as if she had simply been waiting there. "Hello, May," Ruth said. The child closed her eyes again and settled back against her father's shoulder and was asleep in 3 breaths. Daniel looked at Ruth over his daughter's dark head. There was something in his face that was not quite grief and not quite relief and not entirely either one. "I didn't know," he said. "No," Ruth said. "That's what made it a kindness." The November air was cold and still around them, the sound of the social through the door a warm, distant murmur. She could see her own breath in his. She could see the light in the window and the bare branches of the cottonwoods moving slightly at the edge of the dark. She had come to this town 11 years ago and built a life here and lost her husband and kept the farm and gotten through the winters, and she was standing in the cold outside a church social with a man she had sat beside on a Sunday afternoon without knowing who he was, and she was telling him that he had saved her life without knowing he was doing it, and what she felt, saying it, was not grief and not relief. What she felt was that the ground had been there all along. She just hadn't known who placed it. He called on her again the following Thursday, and the Thursday after. By December, she had taken to leaving the porch lamp lit on Thursday evenings, the light visible from the south road. He had not asked her to do it. She had done it because it was practical. The road was dark, and the turning off the south road was easy to miss in the dark, and if she was honest with herself, and she generally was, she had done it for another reason too, which was that she liked knowing the light was burning for someone who would look for it. May came most Thursdays, though not always. On the Thursdays she did not come, she sent messages of varying complexity. A drawing of a brown chicken, a note in her careful new reader, printing that said, "Hello, and also, the horse is fine." A smooth gray stone she had found at the creek and decided Ruth should have, delivered by her father with a formal explanation that May had specifically requested he not lose it. Ruth kept the stone on the kitchen windowsill between the salt crock and the lamp. She did not think about it consciously the way she thought about other things. It was simply there when she looked, the way certain presences settle into a house so gradually you cannot name the moment they arrived. In January, the same month, the same cold, a different year, Daniel came on a Thursday, and the fire in the kitchen stove had gone low because Ruth had been out clearing ice from the stock tank and lost track of the time. He built it back up without comment, finding the wood box and the tinder with the ease of a man who had been in the house enough times to know where things were. And when she came in from washing her hands at the basin, he had the fire going and the coffee pot on and was sitting at the table with his coat still on because the room was not yet warm. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. There was a thing she had been not saying for several weeks. She was a plain woman by nature, and not saying things sat uneasily with her, but this particular thing had required her to be certain of it first, and she was certain now. "I know why you kept coming," she said, after the church steps, "and I know it wasn't obligation." He looked up from the table. "And I know it wasn't pity," she said. "I want you to know that I know that." He was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked and the room began to warm. "Why did you sit down?" he said. "That first Sunday. You could have left me there." "Because I recognized the look," she said, "and because I had sat there myself, and no one had come and sat beside me, and I had wished they had." He held that. "You asked permission," he said. "You didn't just sit." "It was your step too," she said. He stood up from the table and he crossed the kitchen to where she stood, and he was not a man who made speeches or reached for large words, and he did not now. He simply stopped in front of her and looked at her in the warming kitchen in January with the coffee beginning to smell right and the fire going and the porch lamp still lit outside, and he said her name. Ruth. One word. The way you say a word you've been carrying long enough that it has gotten heavy and setting it down feels like something. She met his eyes. "The wood," he said. "I would have come back if I had known." "I know," she said. "That's why I told you." Outside, the January dark was the same dark it always was, flat and cold and wide, the kind that makes a lit window matter. Inside, the fire was going, and the coffee was on, and the kitchen held two people who had each spent long enough alone to understand what the alternative was worth. She took his coat so he could sit without it. He stayed until the lamp needed filling, and then he filled it, and he stayed a while after that. And when he finally went out into the cold, the porch lamp was burning still, and she watched from the window until the wagon turned out onto the south road, and the dark took it. She did not let the fire go out.